The courtroom buzzed with tension, a storm brewing under the polished veneer of justice. Reverend Jasmine Crockett, the firebrand congresswoman from Texas, stood at the defendant's table, her eyes sharp, her posture unyielding. She'd been slapped with a hefty fine by Judge Mark Thompson, a man known for his iron gavel and no-nonsense rulings. The charge, contempt of court, stemming from a fiery outburst during a congressional hearing that had gone viral. But what seemed like a straightforward case was about to unravel into a legal showdown that would leave the nation stunned. Judge Thompson thought he was teaching Crockett a lesson. He had no idea she was about to school him. The packed courtroom in Dallas was a pressure cooker. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras zoomed in, and spectators whispered as the judge's gavel cracked like thunder. Crockett, a former civil rights attorney with a reputation for razor-sharp intellect, wasn't here to play the chastised politician. She was ready to fight. And Judge Thompson, he was about to discover that underestimating Jasmine Crockett was a mistake of epic proportions. Judge Mark Thompson said, "Miss Crockett, you stand before this court accused of contempt stemming from your conduct during a congressional hearing. Your outburst was disrespectful, disruptive, and unbecoming of a public official. Do you have anything to say before I uphold the fine of $10,000? Jasmine Crockett said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I'm not here to gravel or apologize for speaking truth to power. My words in that hearing were calculated. Protected speech under the First Amendment, and I intend to prove this fine, is not only excessive, but unconstitutional. I move to dismiss the charge entirely." A ripple of gasps swept through the courtroom. Judge Thompson's eyebrows shot up, his fingers tightening around his gavel. He wasn't used to defendants, especially high-profile ones, challenging him so directly. Judge Mark Thompson said, "Bold words, Miss Crockett, but boldness doesn't excuse breaking court decorum. Contempt isn't about free speech. It's about maintaining order. You disrupted a federal proceeding. That's not up for debate." Jasmine Crockett said, "Oh, it's very much up for debate, Your Honor. The hearing in question was a public forum, not a courtroom. My comments were directed at systemic corruption, not the presiding officer. If you're finding me for calling out hypocrisy, you're not just punishing me, you're chilling every American's right to dissent." The judge leaned forward, his face a mask of skepticism. He'd dealt with slick lawyers before, but Crockett's confidence was something else. She wasn't just arguing. She was commanding the room, her voice steady, her arguments precise. Judge Mark Thompson said, "You're treading on thin ice, Miss Crockett. The First Amendment doesn't give you a free pass to derail a congressional session. The fine stands unless you can cite precedent that convinces me otherwise." Jasmine Crockett said, "Gladly, Your Honor. Let's start with Fuel versus Flint 1988. The Supreme Court ruled that even offensive speech, if made in a public forum and not inciting imminent lawless action, is protected. My remarks didn't call for violence or disrupt the hearing's function. They exposed a truth. If you fine me for that, you're setting a precedent that any passionate dissent can be silenced with a gavel." The courtroom stirred. Reporters exchanged glances, sensing a story bigger than a simple fine. Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was turning the case into a constitutional crusade. Judge Mark Thompson said Fuel versus Flint dealt with defamation, not contempt. "You're reaching, Miss Crockett. Your outburst halted proceedings for 20 minutes. That's not free speech. That's chaos." Jasmine Crockett said, "Chaos, Your Honor." The chaos was already there. Corrupt officials dodging accountability while the American people watched. My so-called outburst was a 5-sentence call-out that took 30 seconds. The 20-minute delay, that was the chair's decision to grandstand, not mine. Check the transcript. I'm happy to subpoena it. Judge Thompson's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged with such surgical precision. Crockett's legal acumen was undeniable, and the crowd could feel the momentum shifting. Judge Mark Thompson said, "You're suggesting the chair's response, not your actions, caused the disruption. That's a creative spin, but it doesn't absolve you. Contempt is about intent, and your intent was to provoke." Jasmine Crockett said, "Provoke thought, maybe provoke justice, absolutely, but provoke disorder? Never. My intent was to represent my constituents who are fed up with leaders hiding behind procedure to avoid scrutiny. If you're penalizing intent, Your Honor, penalize the officials who ignored evidence of fraud that day. I can cite their names and the docket numbers if you'd like." A murmur of approval rose from the gallery. Crockett was playing to the room, but her arguments were rooted in law, not theatrics. She was dismantling the case piece by piece, and Judge Thompson knew it. Judge Mark Thompson said, "Enough, Miss Crockett. This isn't a soapbox for your political agenda. You're here to answer for your conduct, not to retry the hearing. I'll give you one more chance to present a legal defense, not a manifesto." Jasmine Crockett said, "My defense is legal, Your Honor. Let's talk Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1969. The Supreme Court held that speech is protected unless it incites imminent lawless action and is likely to produce it. My words didn't meet that threshold. They were a critique, not a call to arms. If you find me, you're saying any elected official who speaks out risks punishment. That's not justice. That's censorship." The judge paused, his pen hovering over his notes. Crockett's citation was on point, and he knew it. The Brandenburg Standard was a high bar for proving unprotected speech, and her remarks didn't clearly cross it. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Judge Mark Thompson said, "You're well-versed, Miss Crockett. I'll give you that. But contempt doesn't require incitement. It requires disruption, and you disrupted. The fine is about accountability, not silencing you." Jasmine Crockett said, "Accountability? Then let's talk about Cohen versus California, 1971. The Supreme Court protected a man's right to wear a jacket saying, 'Fuck the draft,' in a courthouse because it was expressive speech, not a direct threat to order. My words were less inflammatory than that, and they were in a legislative setting, not a courtroom. If Cohen's speech was protected, why isn't mine?" The gallery erupted in whispers. Crockett was relentless, weaving precedent into a tapestry of defiance. Judge Thompson shifted in his seat, the weight of her arguments pressing down. Judge Mark Thompson said, "Cohen involved a passive expression, not an active disruption. You spoke out of turn, Miss Crockett, and halted a federal proceeding. That's the line you crossed." Jasmine Crockett said, "Out of turn, Your Honor. I followed the hearing's rules until the chair ignored my point of order. The transcript shows I requested recognition 3 times before speaking. If anyone disrupted procedure, it was the chair, not me. And if you're finding me for a technicality, I'd argue that's selective enforcement. How many others have been fined for similar interruptions in Congress? I'll wait for the data." The judge's face reamed. Crockett's challenge wasn't just legal. It was personal. She was exposing the inconsistency of his ruling, daring him to justify it. Judge Mark Thompson said, "You're testing my patience, Miss Crockett. This court doesn't answer to your hypotheticals. You were cited for contempt, and the fine reflects the severity of your actions." Jasmine Crockett said, "Sever? Let's talk severity." In Texas versus Johnson, 1989, the Supreme Court protected flag burning as expressive speech, even though it provoked outrage. My words provoked discomfort, sure, but they were truthful and aimed at public corruption. If burning a flag is protected, why is calling out a corrupt official contemptuous? Your fine isn't about severity, it's about control. The courtroom was electric. Now Crockett's arguments were a masterclass, blending passion with precision. Spectators leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Even the bailiff seemed to nod slightly. Judge Mark Thompson said, "You're eloquent, Miss Crockett, but you're dodging the core issue. Your speech, protected or not, disrupted a proceeding. That's why you're here. I'm not debating the Constitution. I'm upholding order." Jasmine Crockett said, "Order at what cost, Your Honor? If you find me for speaking out, you're telling every representative to stay silent or face punishment. That's not order. That's authoritarianism." Let's look at New York Times versus United States, 1971. The Pentagon Papers case protected publishing classified documents in the public interest. My remarks expose public misconduct in a public forum. If the press can publish secrets, why can't I call out lies? Judge Thompson rubbed his temple, the weight of Crockett's arguments mounting. She wasn't just citing cases. She was building a narrative of free speech under siege. The reporters in the room were frantic knowing this was front-page material. Judge Mark Thompson said, "You're making this about free speech, Miss Crockett, but it's about responsibility. You're a congresswoman, not a protester. Your role demands restraint." Jasmine Crockett said restraint. "My role demands I represent the people, not protect the powerful." In Tinker versus Des Moines, 1968, the Supreme Court protected students wearing armbands to protest the Vietnam War, even in a school setting. If kids can protest in class, why can't I speak in Congress? My constituents elected me to fight, not to sit quietly while corruption furs. The judge sighed, his resolve wavering. Crockett's relentless barrage of precedent was chipping away at his confidence. The fine, once a simple punishment, now felt like a battleground for constitutional rights. Judge Mark Thompson said, "You've made your point, Ms. Crockett, but I'm not convinced. The fine stands unless you can show your speech didn't disrupt the hearing's purpose." Jasmine Crockett said, "Didn't disrupt? Your Honor, the hearing's purpose was to investigate fraud. My remarks highlighted evidence the chair ignored. Evidence later corroborated by a whistleblower. Far from disrupting, I advanced the hearing's goal. If you find me, you're punishing effective representation. I can call that whistleblower to testify if you'd like." The gallery buzzed. Crockett's trump card, a whistleblower, sent shock waves through the room. Judge Thompson's face betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't expected this. Judge Mark Thompson said, "A whistleblower. That's a bold claim, Miss Crockett. You're turning this into a circus." Jasmine Crockett said, "Not a circus, Your Honor. A reckoning. The whistleblower's testimony filed last week confirms the fraud I exposed. My outburst, as you call it, was the only thing that got that evidence on record. Find me, and you're finding the truth. I'm ready to appeal this to the Supreme Court if I have to." The courtroom fell silent. Crockett's words hung in the air, a challenge to the judge's authority and a rallying cry for justice. Judge Thompson stared at her, his gavel still, his certainty shaken. Judge Mark Thompson said, "You've given me much to consider, Miss Crockett. I'll take this under advisement and issue a ruling by week's end." Court adjourned. The gavel fell, but the story was far from over. As Crockett gathered her papers, the crowd erupted in applause. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, and social media exploded with clips of her performance. Judge Thompson had walked into this thinking he'd tame a firebrand. Instead, he'd met a legal genius who turned his courtroom into her stage. By week's end, the nation would know the outcome. But one thing was clear. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a force, and her fight was only beginning.